Hey, welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans, for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Sunday, September 1st, 2024, and I'm back with you today to give you a few thoughts on Ohio State's 52-6 season opening victory over Akron in the Horseshoe yesterday afternoon. I also want to spend a few minutes on a couple of other games of interest to Buckeye fans from around the Big Ten Conference, but we start, of course, with the Buckeyes, who outscored Akron 35-3 in the second half en route to what turned into the laugher that most of us predicted. Paige, Chad, and I all had final score predictions with the Buckeyes in the 50s. And if you look at the box score, you would assume that this game went to script. And there are a lot of positives, I think, to talk about today. But I do want to begin with what was another very slow and disappointing start to a season opener for Ryan Day's Buckeyes. Most of the struggles came on offense, but it was for the fourth year in a row. Ohio State really struggled through the first half of a season opener with mental mistakes, penalties, drop passes, and missed tackles. And the only difference about this season opener is Akron is not a Power 4 opponent. In fact, as we discussed on the preview pod, the Zips are one of the worst teams in the FBS. So let's start with Ohio State's first possession of the game. And let's face it, it was the football equivalent of a dry fart. It started with a 1-yard run by Trey Henderson, followed by a drop pass from Jeremiah Smith, then a false start penalty, then another incomplete pass from Will Howard to Emeka Egbuka, and the Buckeyes would be forced to punt. Now, on the ensuing Akron possession, Davison Igbinosun would be immediately flagged for a 15-yard late hit on Akron quarterback Ben Finley. And that would be the catalyst for a 10-play, 47-yard drive for Akron that ended with a 48-yard field goal by Garrison Smith, which gave the Zips an early 3-0 lead. Now, the struggles would continue for the Buckeye offense on their third possession of the game, leading 7-3 at the start of the second quarter. The Buckeyes would turn the ball over on downs at the Akron 25-yard line. There was some curious play calling by Chip Kelly at the end of that drive. On 3rd and 7 from the Akron 27, Kelly called a run for Trey Henderson that was stuffed for only 2 yards. Then on 4th down, Will Howard's pass in the flat to Emeka Egbuka was gobbled up by the Akron secondary. That play had no chance of going anywhere. It was a curious play call, given where the play was designed to go. Several yards, way short of the line to gain. It was, I think, the pass was either at the line of scrimmage or behind the line of scrimmage. So, little uneven play calling there by Chip Kelly led to the end of that drive. Finally, there's one other drive I want to mention here. With just over 1 minute to play in the second quarter, the Ohio State defense had just stopped Akron on downs at the Buckeye 35-yard line. Ohio State had all three of their timeouts at their own 35-yard line with just over a minute to play. It was 1:04 to play in the half. Now look, for a Ryan Day offense against an opponent like Akron, we should expect at least a field goal attempt out of that situation. Instead, that possession almost ended in a complete disaster when Will Howard attempted an awkward lateral as he was falling down to Trey Henderson. The ball hit the turf several yards short of Henderson and was nearly scooped up and returned for a touchdown by the Akron defense. So, the first half ended with a whimper by the Buckeye offense. They would take a 17-3 lead into the locker room at halftime. There was really no juice in the stadium whatsoever at that point. And in our text thread, we were all saying to one another, what the hell was that? Now, it wasn't until after Akron bled 6 minutes and 15 seconds off the game clock in the third quarter that things started to improve for the Buckeyes. Akron ran 10 plays for only 19 yards on that possession, and I don't think they were even trying to move the football. It was all about burning clock and making the 100,000 Ohio State fans roasting in the heat absolutely fucking miserable. And they succeeded at that. Then, thankfully, Brandon Inniss would give Ohio State the spark it desperately needed with a 36-yard punt return, and that set the Buckeye offense up at their own 40-yard line. 2 plays later, Will Howard would hit Jeremiah Smith on a 45-yard pass play down to the Akron 2-yard line. On the next play, Quinshon Judkins would punch it in for a touchdown, giving the Buckeyes a 24-3 lead. 18 seconds later, on the ensuing Akron possession, a crushing tackle by Caden Curry on quarterback Taj Bullock forced the ball loose. Lathan Ransom would scoop it up and return it 27 yards for a touchdown, which extended the Ohio State lead to 31-3. And finally, Ohio State fans started having a little fun watching this game. So rough start, but Ohio State turned things around in the second half. I'm going to tick down a list of observations from this game. Look, despite the slow start, I think there was a lot to like from this performance for Ohio State. Let's start with Will Howard. Now, with the exception of the ill-advised failed lateral to Trey Henderson at the end of the second quarter, I was impressed with Howard's play. 17 of 28 for 228 yards passing and 3 touchdown passes. Howard also had a really nice 19-yard scramble to set Ohio State up for their second touchdown of the game in the second quarter. Now, of course, we have to caveat this with it was only Akron, but I thought Howard demonstrated that he could make all the throws, and many of them to Jeremiah Smith, who I'm going to talk about here in a moment. He could make all the throws that Ryan Day requires of his quarterbacks to run the Ohio State offense. I mean, there was the 16-yard back shoulder fade to Smith in the corner of the end zone on Ohio State's first score of the game. He threw a bullet on a slant to Smith for Ohio State's second touchdown. And then there was the aforementioned 45-yard bomb he threw to Smith to set up Ohio State's third touchdown in the third quarter. He also had several other completions to Igbuka and Carnell Tate, where he evaded pressure in the pocket to buy himself a little extra time to get the ball to those receivers. Now, I'd like to see a little more efficiency from Howard. At one point in this game, his completion percentage dipped under 50%. I think he was only 10 of 21 in the first half. But on the whole, I thought it was a very successful debut for Howard, and I think he's only going to get better with more snaps. Now, the other player we have to talk about, I probably should have led with him, is freshman phenom receiver Jeremiah Smith. Wow. 6 receptions on 9 targets for 92 yards and 2 touchdowns. I've watched a lot of talented receivers come through this program. Chris Carter, Joey Galloway, Terry Glenn, David Boston, Michael Jenkins, Ted Ginn Jr., Santonio Holmes, Michael Thomas, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison Jr. We saw flashes from many of those receivers as freshmen, but none of them had a debut quite like what we saw from Jeremiah Smith yesterday. Now, from that list I just mentioned, I'd say Chris Carter is the only one who was Ohio State's number 1 receiver the minute he arrived in Columbus. It was only one game against Akron, but was there any doubt who Ohio State's best receiver was yesterday? I mean, it was Jeremiah Smith, definitively. Now, Smith earned Iron Buckeye status during the offseason. I believe he's the only freshman to have earned that distinction. He was also the fastest freshman to have his black stripe removed in program history. He is him, as the kids like to say. Now, I want to see him do it against better defenses like Iowa, Penn State, Oregon, and Michigan. But I think what Jeremiah Smith did yesterday, even considering the competition, was remarkable. I mean, once in a generation. Let's talk a little bit about the Ohio State running game. Now, this is an area I mentioned in our preview pod that I'd be watching very closely in this game. And this is one of 2 major areas I said a few pods ago that Ohio State had to raise to a championship level. Ohio State has not run the ball at a championship level, I'd say, for the last 3 seasons. Last year, most especially. Now, as it would turn out, I got a little over my skis predicting 350 rushing yards for the Buckeyes in this game. And I think the best thing I can say about the way they ran the ball yesterday was that it was a mixed bag. Now, I don't think it helped matters that starting left guard Donovan Jackson was a late scratch and did not play. But also, I don't think it should have mattered given the competition. Austin Saraveld replaced Jackson at left guard. And according to PFF, Saraveld led all Ohio State offensive linemen with 66 snaps yesterday. Now, the Buckeyes finished with 170 yards rushing on 33 carries. That's 5.2 yards per carry. Trey Henderson, who I thought looked very good, led the rushing attack with 65 yards on 8 carries. That's 8.1 yards per carry. Hard to complain too much about that. And I think if Ohio State had been facing a better opponent yesterday, they certainly would have leaned more on Henderson than they did. Quinshon Judkins finished with 55 yards on 13 carries and a touchdown in his Buckeye debut. He was solid, but not spectacular. Now, on their face, these numbers, 170 yards and 33 carries look pretty good. But if you adjust for the competition, I don't think we can say the running game is where it needs to be yet. Ohio State, look, they really struggled to run the ball inside for much of the first half. Judkins, he's kind of their designated interior running back, and there was not a lot of room for him to run early in this game. I thought the offensive line did a better job in the second half, but only 6 yards on 4 carries for Judkins in the first quarter. There was also a tush-push on 3rd and inches by Will Howard on Ohio State's first scoring drive that Akron nearly stopped. I mean, if Howard was 2 inches shorter, I don't think Ohio State would have converted on that play. Now, I think you can point to 3 new starters on the interior of the offensive line is probably the culprit here. Sareveld was pressed into duty at left guard, as I mentioned, with Donovan Jackson out. You had a new starting center in Seth McLaughlin. You had a new starting right guard in Tegra Shabola. Now, Bill Landis said in his post-game column today, I'm going to quote him here, quote, "The early issues in the run game against Akron's front might be forgivable if they weren't so familiar. And to the credit of the 5 guys who started, things looked cleaner in the second half. But for a team that talked all offseason about wanting to run the ball more and better, and who touted the offensive line's progress throughout camp, that didn't look like progress. It looked like more of the same," end quote. Now, Donovan Jackson, he's expected to return next week. He was in uniform yesterday and actually went through pregame warmups before being a late scratch. Reports are that he was held out as a precaution. I personally want to see how the offensive line looks when Jackson is back before I hit any panic buttons here. As Landis noted, the offensive line was much better in the second half, and whatever was going on up front didn't seem to bother Trey Henderson. I mean, if he's running for 8 yards per carry, and the Akron defense did not register a single tackle for loss in this game. So at this stage, I'm much more inclined to chalk up the early struggles in the run game to, early season rust and the absence of a key cog in Jackson than anything else. All right, let's have a look at how the defense performed in this game. I think the Silver Bullets were mostly as advertised, though according to PFF, they did miss 11 tackles in this game. 3 of them were by star safety Caleb Downs. It wasn't the greatest debut for Downs yesterday. He finished with the defense's lowest grade for tackling, according to PFF, with a grade of 23.4. Downs is obviously going to be fine. I am not worried about him in the least. Otherwise, there was a lot to like about the performance of the defense, against, granted, a very limited Akron offense who had to play most of the second half without their starting quarterback, Ben Finley. Finley had to leave the game with what looked like an injury to his ribs or sternum. Now, what stood out to me in this game from the defense was the abundance of havoc plays. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. This is the other major area I noted a few weeks ago where Ohio State had been well below championship level and even well below the program's own historical averages the last 3 years. But not yesterday. 10 tackles for loss, 5 quarterback sacks, 3 takeaways, including 2 defensive scores. There was the scoop and score by Lathan Ransom and a pick 6 by linebacker Gabe Powers. Denzel Burke also came up with a gorgeous interception in the second quarter, stripping the ball away from the Akron receiver. That play was a little reminiscent of the play Burke made in the Michigan game on the Roman Wilson touchdown, only this time Burke was credited with the INT. Only 177 yards of total offense for Akron in this game. The Silver Bullets held the Zips to 4 of 16 on third down and only 1.3 yards per carry in the run game. Lathan Ransom led the Buckeyes with 9 tackles. He had 2 tackles for loss and the aforementioned scoop and score. Ransom led the secondary with an overall PFF grade of 83.6. Look, all the talk this offseason has been about Caleb Downs, and deservedly so. But when healthy, Lathan Ransom is one of the best safeties in the country in his own right. I'm expecting big things from Ransom the rest of the way. You just pray for health because he's had several season-ending injuries in his career. Now, of the starters, Tyleik Williams and Jack Sawyer were the highest graded defenders according to PFF, with grades of 88.7 and 85.4 respectively. Williams was the Buckeyes' second leading tackler in this game. He had 7 tackles, and that included 1.5 tackles for loss. JT Tuimoloau also finished with 1.5 tackles for loss, including a sack. I also love what I saw out of Caden Curry in this game. Curry finished with a whopping PFF grade of 90.3 on 16 snaps. It was Curry who delivered the crushing tackle to force the ball loose on Ransom's scoop and score. Finally, I thought Arvell Reese flashed yesterday at linebacker. Reese was a player we heard about over and over again throughout fall camp. In 33 snaps, Reese finished with a solid PFF grade of 75 yesterday. Man, I get big-time Ryan Shazier vibes watching Reese. And to me, he looks like Ohio State's best linebacker right now. He's just much quicker to the football, I think, than the rest of the group, and that includes Sonny Styles. Now, Cody Simon, who was he was also a late scratch yesterday and did not play. He's going to be the man at the mic when he comes back. But I think Arvell Reese is going to play a lot of snaps this season, so keep your eye on Arvell Reese. So, after what was probably a D performance by Ohio State in the first half of this game, I'm going to give the Buckeyes a solid A in the second half. Overall, let's call it a C+ for the Buckeyes if you adjust for the competition. Now, if we're looking at this performance through the lens of was it good enough to beat Oregon, Penn State, or Michigan? Well, I'm going to talk about it here in a minute. With the way Oregon and Michigan looked yesterday, I'd say yeah. But was it good enough to beat Georgia, Texas, or Bama? Was it good enough to win 3 or 4 straight playoff games? No, it wasn't. But look, it's September 1st, and the Buckeyes don't have to be playing at that level right now. They're going to get better. I'm expecting big improvements as soon as next week against Western Michigan. Okay, I'm going to touch quickly on 2 other games in the Big Ten. First, let's start with Michigan's 30-10 win over Fresno State last night in Ann Arbor. If you did not watch this game, don't let that final score fool you. This game was much, much closer than the final score would suggest. It was a 6-point game midway through the fourth quarter before Michigan scored 2 late touchdowns to pull away. Now, with Michigan leading 23-10 with 3:57 to play, Fresno State had the ball first and goal at the Michigan 10-yard line and was poised to cut the lead to 1 score. But Will Johnson saved the day, picking off Fresno State's Mikey Keene and returning it 86 yards for a touchdown that would seal the game for Michigan. Now, I said in our preview pod that I didn't think it'd be a Mona Lisa on offense for Michigan in this game. And that wasn't exactly going out on a limb, considering all the production they lost from last year's team. It was an ugly night on that side of the ball for Michigan. Only 269 yards of total offense for the Wolverines in this game. Sharon Moore decided to start walk-on Davis Warren at quarterback over Alex Orji, though Orji did play. Warren finished with 118 yards passing, 1 touchdown, and a pick. Orji only attempted 2 passes, completing 1 for 3 yards. He also had 32 yards rushing on 5 carries. Starting running back Donovan Edwards, who had a disappointing 2023 season, finished with only 27 yards on 11 carries last night. Khalil Mullings, actually, I think, was much more of a factor running the football than Edwards. Mullings finished with 92 yards on 15 carries. And to me, he looks much more like the prototypical Michigan back than Edwards. I think you have to wonder if Mullings won't end up as the starter here before too long. Tight end Colston Loveland led Michigan in receiving with 87 yards on 8 receptions. He's a very, very good player. He is far and away Michigan's most valuable weapon on offense, so there's no doubt about it. But look, man, Michigan's best offense in this game was its defense. Their first touchdown was set up by a Zeke Berry interception of Mikey Keene on Fresno State's first possession of the game. That gave the Michigan offense a first down at the Fresno State 31-yard line. And then it was Will Johnson's pick 6 late, as I mentioned, that sealed the game. I mean, without those 14 points generated by the Michigan defense, I don't think the Wolverines win this game. Now, yeah, look, the defense for Michigan still very, very good, among the best in the country. It might be the only reason they win games this season. But I think it could be a very, very long afternoon next Saturday for Michigan against Texas. I'm really looking forward to that game. I think they're going to struggle to score points against the Longhorns. And as good as that Michigan defense is, I think that Texas offense, they're going to get their points. They're going to move the ball. They're going to score points. And then it's going to be incumbent on the Michigan offense to try and muster up, some points in this game. So, yeah, again, could be a very long afternoon for Michigan next week against the Longhorns. All right, one last game I want to touch on quickly before I let you go. Now, if you're like our good friend Paige Van Horn, who thought Ohio State played like shit yesterday, allow me to introduce you to number 3 Oregon, holding on for dear life to beat the Idaho Vandals 24-14 last night. Oregon was a 44.5-point favorite at home in this game. The Vandals are a good, but certainly not great FCS team. They were a 9-4 team a year ago. They lost by 2 touchdowns to Cal last year. Now, I didn't get a chance to watch much of this game. I didn't really tune in until the second half when I noticed the score. And then I was toggling between this game and Fresno State, Michigan. Dylan Gabriel finished 41 of 49 with 380 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. Running back Jordan James finished with 95 yards on 15 carries. But the Vandals otherwise held the Oregon run game in check. Adjusted for sack yardage, only 130 yards on 34 carries for the Ducks. That's 3.8 yards per carry. Now, last season, Oregon was second nationally in scrimmage plays of 30-plus yards. But last night, against an FCS defense, they didn't have a single play over 30 yards. Their longest run from scrimmage was 16 yards. Their longest pass play was only 24. The Vandals twice stopped the Ducks on 4th and short on Oregon's side of the field. The Ducks missed a field goal at the end of the first quarter. They fumbled deep in Vandal territory to squander another scoring opportunity in the second quarter. So look, PVH, while you're handing out those F- grades, my friend, don't forget about the Oregon Ducks. They were dreadful in this game yesterday, and they were very lucky to escape with the win. All right, that's going to do it for me. Look for a preview of Ohio State's next opponent, Western Michigan, from all of us on Thursday. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.